Washington Journal continues.
We're back with the Fulcrums, Debilyn, Molineaux, and David Riordan. They'll be discussing their podcast, Vital Signs of Democracy, and political news of the day. Good morning, David and Debilyn.
Good morning, Tia. Good to be here.
Good morning. Thanks for having us.
Debilyn, I want to start with you. Tell us about the Fulcrum, of which you're the co-publisher, its mission, how it started, how it's funded.
Yeah, thank you. One of the first thing, it was founded in 2019-ish by some folks who really wanted to get the news about democracy reform efforts around the country. And there really wasn't a lot of coverage back then on democracy reform itself. So the Fulcrum became the gathering point. When we took over the Fulcrum in 2021, we expanded coverage to include pro-democracy or healthy democracy activity and opinions, and make the Fulcrum a place where the American public can come to be informed, interact, and really engage in democracy.
And tell us about the podcast. Why did you decide to launch Vital Signs of Democracy, and why now?
Yeah, well, David came to us with this idea about the podcast for Vital Signs, and he noted that we have rating systems for a lot of elements that we want to get at the quick glance on. Like, if we don't want to have to dive into the deep detail, what is the quick glance? And so he really developed this idea on Vital Signs of Democracy to scan the news to see whether it was taking us closer to democracy, the narratives that were out there, or if it was taking us away from democracy. And that's where the meter came from. The podcast came about because we wanted to give people then something to do. And that's why it was a good match for the Fulcrum. If we can provide people with some ways to think about the news as they're observing and taking in the news, and then provide them a way to perform their citizen duties in a healthy way, that is what the podcast is all about.
So, David, I want to bring you in. You have a background in entertainment. Kind of, how did you become involved with the website and the podcast? What is your role in the podcast?
Well, the Vital Signs is really about the power of stories. And so I come out of the entertainment business, long career in that. And when we looked at stories about the now and the future at a certain point, they mostly seemed to be dystopian. It mostly was what we seemed to imagine. There wasn't much positive there. So we started to look at the news and collect and analyze subjective stories because, basically there are two ways that humans make sense of things, right? There is the data and the information, and then there are the subjective stories that we make up to give the data and information meaning to us. So we were really interested in the subjective stories that were driving the particular political environment, and I think it's fair to say that at this particular point we have two major Make America Great narratives that are competing with each other, and that seems to be driving events much more than people looking at the facts.
And David, I'll stick with you. How do you guys decide on topics for your podcast?
Well, Debilyn and I will, sort of we look across 10 categories. That's what Vital Signs does. And we, create the measurement that's at vitalsignsofdemocracy.com every 2 weeks, right? But there are generally sort of hidden stories, things that we see as a theme that aren't necessarily making it to the mainstream yet, but we think are important. And so each of us will pick one of those, and that is particularly of interest to us, and then we go at that and try to see what's really happening with that particular story.
So again, we're talking with the host this morning of the Vital Signs of Democracy podcast. We want to get to the phone lines. So as a reminder, if you have a question about their podcast or about political news of the day, we want you to start calling in. Republicans, 202-748-8001. Democrats, 202-748-8000. And Independents, 202-748-8002. Go ahead, start calling in now. We'll get to those calls in just a moment. Debilyn, your inaugural podcast was back in February, and it focused the Make America Great storyline that David just mentioned, competing for our attention. So Tell me more about this kind of big project on the two Make America Great narratives and how that set the tone for the podcast overall.
So this, the way we frame the two Make America Great stories, and I need to credit David with coming up with that kind of framing of it, was really a way to think about what has been called the culture wars writ large, but in a different frame and in one where we might be able to take a step back and just observe a little bit more about the stories that we're hearing instead of being inside the story. And so a lot of what the podcast is about helping us observe the stories that are coming to us through the media instead of being captured, if you will, by the stories themselves and then creating an enemy of the other story or people that were in the other story. Because we are one America, and it's not like divorce is really possible.
So, David, in your most recent episode, you point out that 75% of MAGA Republicans still believe the 2020 election was stolen by Democrats. What percentage of GOP voters are considered MAGA Republicans, and how do they feel about a potential second term for former President Trump?
Well, what we're seeing in our narrative analysis, because that's the way we look at it. I mean, we do look at the numbers and polls and all that, but we look at the stories being told. And generally, and I'm going to be very general about this because there are experts that are much better at this than me. The MAGA part of the Republican Party, generally that core audience is 30 to 35% by most people's count, right? And then you have moderate Republicans. Let's not forget that the MAGA Republicans make the most noise, so they get heard the most. But there are also moderate Republicans that, in the last election still voted for Trump, even though maybe some of his policies they didn't agree with. So you've got this Republicans and Democrats, but then you've got this huge group in the middle that is expanding, which are the independents. That's what we are. I'm an independent. I'm not particularly crazy about either the Republican or Democratic Party for a number of reasons. And we are really making the difference in these swing states, in these very close elections, about which way it is going to lean.
Let's go to the phone lines now. Again, a reminder, Republicans 202-748-8001, Democrats 202-748-8000, Independents 202-748-8002. You can also send us a text message, 202-748-8003. First up is Zachary in Tampa, Florida, Independent line.
Yes, hello, guys. How are we doing? I'm a Marine, old Marine, so let's start with that. And for leadership, as a Marine, as a squad leader, as a section chief, you're always looking out for your people. So I believe any leader of this country, whether it be Democrat, Republican, first priority is to this country and should be looking out for the benefit of the people of this country. So if I measure those things against what I look at Trump and I look at Biden certainly has done a better job as his presidency to do that. The thing I'm really concerned with is the media and these podcasts. I listen to them regularly, too, and I certainly listen to C-SPAN for years. But the thing I have a concern about is that the media is presenting false narratives to all their constituents, and that's a real problem. Not all the media. I wouldn't say that totally, but certainly there's, and I won't call names, but we know who there are, but conservative media seems to be poisoning my neighbors. They don't speak to me anymore. We don't speak. I mean, I've lived in a great neighborhood, but people don't speak anymore because of these types of narratives. So my question, I guess, is the media not causing a lot of these concerns that we're having?
Debilyn?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you for your service, and amen, brother, to the leadership that we need right now. Secondly, there's some texts out there, or there's a book out there called, it's by Amanda Ripley. I forget the name of the book off the top of my head. But she highlights something called conflict profiteers. And so much of the media right now is actually not news coverage. It's actually conflict profiteering. And I want to point out that there's a distinction there between true journalism and conflict profiteering, because those people who masquerade as journalists, who masquerade as media, but what they're actually doing is fomenting outrage. We need to put them in the proper context and see them for the conflict profiteers that they are, and find a way to mitigate or make them irrelevant, in my opinion.
It looks like that name of that book by Amanda Ripley is High Conflict.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
All right, let's go to another caller, Brian. Brian is in Rochester, Minnesota, independent line.
Hey, good morning. First and foremost, I just want to give a huge shout out to C-SPAN and everybody there. Last 20 years, you guys have been a lifeline of information for me and a lot of people before that. So first and foremost, thank you. The question I've got for the guests today, I'm just wondering what they think the July 26th hearing on UAP, for example, that issue. I'm wondering what they think that issue might have to say about the health of our democracy. It seemed oddly bipartisan, especially in that long hearing. And I'll end my question there before I ramble more. Thank you guys so much.
David, that's that hearing on UAPs, better known or formerly known as UFOs. Is there anything you think we can draw about politics today from that hearing?
Well, when we look at stories that are currently afoot within the culture, and we ask ourselves the question, what could change things? The UFO story has been around for a long time, and you can just imagine that if at some point there is some admittance that there is a connection with life off this planet, this changes everything. I mean, we're talking about the political environment today, and that's really important. But if that actually ever happened, that significantly would change all of humanity, and I'm not going to sit here and predict how that would go. So I'm happy to see that the whole UFO story is getting drawn, sort of out of the fringes and into the mainstream, because there's a lot to talk about there, and we're tracking this very heavily at Vital Signs, because it is one of those potential changes that could make a difference to everything.
Orlando, Washington, D.C., Democratic line.
Hey, just a question and a comment. Is it possible that you said it yourself that the independence is making sort of a difference? I think that's what you said. So is it possible that independents, along with some Trump supporters, are also putting more favor towards Trump by not voting for the Democrats? I mean, the independents, you say they're making a difference, but are they making that impact that the voters actually swinging to the right for all the rhetoric that we have on? Is the independents making a positive impact, or your vote making a negative impact as to what's going on right now? Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
I think so. Let's let Debilyn weigh in.
Yeah, Orlando, thank you for that question. I'm going to say I'm going to reframe the question to say, how can independents make the most healthy the most healthy choice in their voting patterns, if you will, especially in the swing states? Because just a fact there, most independents actually make up a larger percentage of registered voters than Democrats or Republicans. And it's, I think last I heard was about 42%. And younger people in the 18 to 34-year-old category actually make up a higher percentage of independents than that, because they see the dysfunction within the political parties. So independent voters right now are being courted, if you will, by both of the mainstream narratives that David and I cover in the podcast, to either make America great by, the MAGA Republican story, or the Make America Great, which is kind of the pluralistic, multiracial democracy, the pluralistic. And so those are the two narratives that the independents are choosing between. I think a fascinating piece to look at from a narrative standpoint is how could independents organize themselves to not swing to one of those two major stories, but actually maybe create a third story.
And kind of along those same lines, did you want to say something, David?
Well, and what we're seeing when we talk about independence, and as we start this 2024 presidential election season, is that there are independent efforts, No Labels is the one that is getting the most news at the moment, that are well-funded, that are considering offering a different choice if it ends up being Trump and Biden as the two major party characters. How that is going to affect the 2024 election just throws more questions, makes it more unstable, I think, in a certain sense about how that all might work out if none of the candidates actually get a majority of the vote. And then sort of like, then what do we do? So that's something to really watch as we head into the 2024 election, is what is going to be the influence of those independent candidates.
Along those same lines, when it comes to kind of less polarized politics, is the issue of gerrymandering. And in our previous segment, we had a caller, his name is Edel, and he said that he would like some discussion on the Alabama redistricting case specifically. Have you guys looked much at Alabama specifically, or redistricting as a whole? Alabama was supposed to have a new map that was less gerrymandered and would allow particularly black voters to be able to elect a second member of Congress, but the state leaders chose not to adhere to those guidelines in this revised map. Debilyn?
Yeah, I actually think David's better suited to
Okay.
answer this question because he's been looking at this difference between when states ignore federal law or ignore the courts in this case.
All right, go ahead, David.
Well, I'm going to pick on the MAGA Republicans here. Remember, I'm an independent, but I'm going to look at them because this is, particularly in Alabama, but in other places, this is the Republican Party attempting to do something about how the districts are laid out. And normally, in the past, when a party continued to lose elections, they would then try to expand their base. And if you want to look at the right, you can look at Ronald Reagan as they expanded his base hugely to include people of color and women and so on. In this particular case, it seems to us, from a narrative standpoint, that the MAGA Republicans have given up trying to attract a majority of voters. And so what they're trying to do then, if that's what you're going to do, then you need to then, in a sense, suppress certain votes so that you can win as a minority in the Electoral College. So what's going on in Alabama, which is what, in addition to just the gerrymandering, is the fact that the Supreme Court, which is very conservative by any means and measurement, has already said that there need to be two districts, and this state of Alabama has said, well, we're not actually going to do that. And so this is something that is indicating where we might be going when you have states that will look at the federal opinion and say, we're not going to follow it anymore. That is not good for democracy in America.
All right, back to the phone lines. Mike is calling from Stockton, California on the independent line.
Hello, good morning, everybody. I just wanted to make a couple of statements and my own opinions about things. There used to be a program, Leave It to Beaver, came on, and I noticed a lot of times when the father was speaking to his son would make a statement like, gee, Dad, you don't have to yell at a fella. And the father would turn on, I never even raised my voice with him. Just exaggeration. And that's what's going on right now. It's a lot of exaggerations that are not even true. And it's just sort of like a psychosis or something. Now, I'd like a slogan to come out, Trump, T-R-O-M-P, T-R-U-M-P, Trump. My brother calls him the Agent Orange, and I call Rudy Giuliani the melting man. So America is in a dark spot right now. We're going through a very dark chapter. All the false and exaggerations. I'm just almost want to give up. And I'm glad the new poll's coming out showing that only 14% of the Republicans are believing this now. And they need to get down to just about zero. Donald Trump needs to just go to prison and get it over with. He knew he was lying. He knew the election wasn't stolen.
Mike, we got your point. Let's let Debilyn respond to some of the points raised by Mike.
Yeah, thank you. And Mike, thank you for calling. You obviously haven't given up yet, or you wouldn't be calling. So I just want to make that note. But I have a lot of friends who are resigned right now, who have given up. And what that actually does, when we citizens delegate our power to those who are still in the system, who are still active, it actually concentrates that power in the hands of a few. And so to the extent that we can find a way to get up off our couches and go out and find others who think like we do, who think that really citizens need to be the center of this government instead of the manipulated consumer of politics, that is where our power lies. And people wouldn't focus, these conflict profiteers wouldn't focus on the outrage and others focus on suppressing votes if it didn't matter. They actually would ignore us if it didn't matter. And so I just want to, I sound a little evangelical right now about citizenship and voting because I am, but please, I can hear that you care deeply and that you're disappointed, and find some colleagues who think like you do and bolster each other up.
Let's go to International Falls, Minnesota now. Brad is calling on the Republican line.
Well, good morning there. I've got just a couple quick questions, and the first question is real quick, is that why didn't Jack Smith, he used all of Trump's words about whatever, but in his indictment he never said that Trump said to go there peacefully and patriotically. That's a question. The second question is, if 20 shell companies doing no business isn't, a proof of corruption, what's a reasonable explanation? Thank you.
David, do you want to take this caller?
Yeah, I think I certainly understand the perspective. The thing we have to look at from a story standpoint is that there are lots of stories in the environment. And when we say these are things that Trump said or didn't say, there is a plethora of things that he has said and continues to say over time. And so it's easy, depending on the story that you want to believe, to sort of cherry pick those comments and find the ones that kind of support your feeling about him one way or another. But I think that what's going to happen with Jack Smith is that we're going to move out of this sort of political environment where everybody can say anything that they want, and it just seems crazy from day to day. And we're actually going to go into court, and Jack Smith is going to have to prove that whatever Trump said that he feels is criminal behavior, he's going to have to prove that. And at that point, then all of the conversations that we have outside of the court system will fall away. And one way or another, whatever Trump has said is either going to incriminate him or it won't.
So I want to ask you a question we're getting on social media, and I have some articles pulled up that are relevant to that question. There's an article in The Hill. It says Biden allies brush off calls for primary debates. And again, it's all about how President Biden isn't being advised that he should debate any of those kind of long shot challengers. But then Newsweek also has an article. It says Donald Trump rules out attending debates, says, quote, Reagan didn't do it. And it's all about the fact that President Trump also may not debate the other Republicans vying for that party's nomination in 2024. I want to pull up a tweet from BMW Tony I. It says, still waiting. I'm sorry, that's not the one I wanted to pull up. This is a tweet from Myland at East NE. It says, is Trump refusing to debate Ron DeSantis, Chris Christie, is it good for democracy? That's the question I wanted to ask you. David, I'll start with you.
Well, when we look at this whole question of debates, I mean, it's an American tradition that candidates would show up on a stage and we get to listen to what they have to say, and we also get to listen to what they have to say, to each other. I think that this is a sign of the times, and particularly as we move into the 2024 election. If we go back to 2020, once Biden was selected by the Democrats to be their candidate and Trump had already been selected by the Republicans, the choice was really clear. I mean, you could go one way or another, and certainly we all said democracy was on the ballot, which I think it was. And, as a result, Biden won that election. When we look into 2024, and you've got 70% of the voters, at least in polls, and we have to remember these are polls, so it's just one perspective, saying that they don't like either one of them. Now, this isn't uncommon. We saw this also in 2016 with Hillary and Trump, that the two choices are it's like the worst of two choices, and people are just tired of making that. So a candidate that is that far ahead as Trump is at the moment, and certainly as Biden is dominating the Democratic side, the common wisdom is that you don't go to debates. You don't open up that can of worms and let people talk or, whatever to your policies. I don't think that does a service. I think it's a disservice, I should say, on both sides. That if you're not willing to show up and sort of meet the current challenges, which are very different than, say, 2020, and help us clear up some of the murkiness that we feel about this particular election going forward and all of our fears about it, then I think that's just a sign that democracy has weakened. And I would encourage both parties and independents to show up and debate each other and let the voters decide who they want.
Debilyn?
Yeah, David is so right in that Biden and Trump only have things to lose if they were to show up and debate. But bigger than that, and the politics industry is kind of the one who makes those decisions, who says that you don't create an opening for vulnerability. And that's the politics industry, which has continued to grow strength and actually underpins everything we're talking about here today. But also what it does is it thwarts any new ideas from emerging or any new coalitions from forming, because the system has already been rigged to say we're going to just focus on the people who already have the power. And that's part of why, as citizens, we all need to get more active in the political system and the election system itself and think about ranked choice voting and redistricting or other types of voting mechanisms. It doesn't have to be ranked choice voting. That's the current favored system today, because it actually provides us with more opportunity and less divisiveness.
All right, back to the phone lines. Dennis, Wayne, New Jersey, Democratic line.
Yeah, how you doing? I had a question, but I think I'm going to change it. And since I was listening to things that were said, I guess our democracy, in a large part, is based on our faith in the system. And if we lose that, I'm afraid of things. But I think my faith is still in the people. And I'll give you an example. Like, when I've served on juries, and we got trials coming up. Okay, I found that the majority of the people that I was serving with, okay, you went in. It didn't matter whether you were Republican, Democrat, Independent. It didn't matter where your political views went. Everybody I served with saw that as a sacred duty. And when we went in there, people, you became a blank slate. And you listen to what was happening, and that's where my faith, my faith lies, and I hope that continues. And so I don't know hear what you guys have to say about that.
Debilyn, why does it seem that things are so much more polarized now?
I'm going to go back to the conflict profiteers and pick on them a little bit more, because they're starting with I think talk radio. Back in the 80s, I want to guess, this was a way for folks to make money off of expressing opinions that seemed unpopular, if you will, unpopular by the mainstream. And as they continued to propagate, they became more and more popular until now. I think the conflict profiteer narratives, the stories that David and I are following in the Vital Signs podcast, have now become the major stories, the major narratives. And so instead of it being kind of this like, crazy uncle in the corner talking, or our crazy aunt over in the other corner talking, and they're talking about two different things, that now has become like the public narratives about democracy. Democracy is actually a really messy process, and it's how we as a people decide and make decisions together about our future. And the conflict profiteers have captured us in such a way that we no longer participate in the same way.
Let's hear.
Can I add something?
Of course.
Can I add something to that?
Mm-hmm.
So the whole issue of polarization, and we look at this from a narrative standpoint, and obviously we say, yes, there are two narratives that are competing with each other, and they just don't seem to be able to listen to each other as we used to. There is one sign of hope, and the caller's notion about faith has warmed my heart in the sense that we all have to keep the faith that the system is somehow going to be able to respond to these challenges. But here's the sign of hope. If you look at national polls, and we look at 10 categories of things that we think are going to affect democracy, and they're things that you would normally think of, things like voting rights, a woman's right to choose, what we're doing with climate change, the independence of the justice system, all those things, depending on how that goes, is going to impact our democracy one way or another. But when you look at the national polls on any of those subjects, you've got 65 to 70% of Americans, and that group is made up of moderate conservatives, independents, and moderate liberals that generally agree. Now, they may be very heated with each other about how to accomplish something, but they agree that voting ought to be easy. They agree that a woman should have a right to choose in this particular culture. They agree that the Justice Department should be, going after people in a way that the legal system is forthright and transparent. So when we look at that and you say, well, all right, if there's 65 to 70% of Americans, then what is the polarization? Part of it is the media, and I think that is true. It does get promoted by that. But what we see from both parties is neither party either has an interest in trying to call that group to stand up for democracy, or they don't know how. And when we look forward, we think that whatever is going to transpire in the days ahead, that if somebody can figure out a narrative that would actually attract that group, and the majority of Americans stand up and push the extremes back out to where they belong, which is on the edge of the conversation, then our democracy, really may have a chance to strengthen itself.
Yeah, and the politics industry has actually catered to the more extreme viewpoints because of the way our primary system works. And so, one of the things we need to look at is how do we conduct our primaries, because that's where the extreme voters show up, and whoever wins the primary wins the general election in many, like 90% of congressional districts right now.
Let's hear from Ed now. Ed is in Newport Richey, Florida, on the independent line.
Good Saturday morning from the free state of Florida. A solution to our political problems in the country is to have a God and Country party comprised of military veterans. There's only 17 veterans in the Senate and only 47 veterans in the Congress. And our hope for the future is in the hands of the veteran. It is the soldier, not the minister, who has given us freedom of religion. It is the soldier, not the reporter, who has given us freedom of press. It is the soldier, not the poet, who has given us freedom of speech. It is the soldier, not the campus organizer, who has given us freedom of protest. It is the soldier, not the lawyer.
Ed, I got your point. We got your point. David, what do you think about his thoughts about putting soldiers in charge of American politics, or veterans?
Well, it goes right to the heart of, do we need something else than the binary choice that we have? And whether you couch your story in that that's a veterans party or a God party, or what we're seeing in that 65 to 70% of Americans that we talked about before, is that the question is not Republican or Democrat, and we're not the first ones to say that. The question is, are we Americans, and what does that mean? And we have fought with each other forever between conservative and liberal opinions about what we should do going forward. But it was within certain guardrails. Those guardrails now we've blown through, so that the conversation now seems much more extreme, at the main center. So I understand the caller's frustration. I feel it every day. Isn't there something else we could do than the choice that we have right now? And I think, as I said earlier, we're going to see whether any of these independent efforts in the 2024 election are actually going to gain traction and have an influence on what happens in the election.
Christine, Woonsocket, Rhode Island, Democratic line.
Good morning. Thank you for your service. It's very educational. I hope somebody learned something from what you're talking about. I'm not going to talk about Democrat, Republican. I'm going to talk about American, USA. I totally agree with that man just said. I'm from Florida. I believe that the military and the vets, they paid their dues, and they're trying to keep our country safe. But when you have a person running around the country and using propaganda through the Fox News, and I seen this, I watched it all the way, and even watching the second impeachment, if they wanted to know any more information, they would have continued with the hearing. And they all took an oath on the Bible. So if they don't feel, at a time like this, I can't see Democrats and Republicans attacking each other. Right now, the United States needs to be together. This was all Putin's plan from 2017. They stood out there and said it was like bombs dropping. It was worse than September 11th. So people, please, let's just tone it down. Think, listen.
All right.
I'm not even going to mention it.
Gotcha, Christine. Got your point. Debilyn.
Yeah, Christine, I love what you're saying, and I hear the passion in your voice. And I wonder if you wanted to look up an organization called livingroomconversations.org. This is a do-it-yourself, get to know your friends and family better, and talk about topics in a way that is not heated, but actually shares stories that, it feeds right into, David and I's podcast a little bit, because it's actually helping us see people's stories and how it helped them develop their beliefs. And I just had a sense, Christine, when you were talking, that might be something you would want to do to help get to know people in a different way. We had some churches who use living room conversations. I co-founded this organization for clarity's sake. And there were people who in the church that did a living room conversation, and they came away from it, from the first conversation, saying, I found out something about this person I've known for 30 years, and I feel like I know them much deeper now than I didn't know that I didn't know them. So it's something citizens can do to help.
All right, on the Republican line, Bob calling from Seattle, Washington.
Hey, everybody. Certainly enjoy watching C-SPAN and all that you provide, but I have for the two folks and all of you just about democracy and about ballots and voting. If we want to, I look at the state of Washington and how secure voting is by mail-in ballot and the ease of voting. How is it that we only have, and I say, 11 states in the union that vote by mail, and why that doesn't get more accelerated? I come from the printing industry, and I'm surrounded by what happens with a ballot. Printers that print those ballots, the ease in which it is to vote by. And what is it, do you think, is a suppression on, I'll say, on the far right to not want to have vote by mail throughout the United States? It is, I just look at it, and then the narrative by Trump to talk about that in a negative way. You saw Louis DeJoy back off of his appointment to that and say, listen, this guy's going down the wrong path. The mail has to move in a certain way.
And Bob, thanks for the call. Debilyn, quick response.
Yeah, this is part of the politics industry rigging it so their candidates can win. And if they can't win by growing their base, as David pointed out earlier, they're going to win by changing the rules so that they have all the power.
And David, any quick final thoughts?
Well, the thing I would add to that is that the story may be changing. I mean, so what he's talking about is that on the MAGA Republican side, there has been there is their story, which is they only trust the votes that take place on the day of the election at election voting places. So day of vote is talked about a lot when we watch these elections happen, and they don't trust mail-in ballots because they consider that to be more of a liberal vote. But given that the fact that Trump lost in 2020, that the 2022 election didn't turn out for them, we're starting to see that narrative change. And I think that the whole idea of voting by mail or just making it easy to vote, in addition to whatever you would do on the day of, that is going to get a lot more support from the Republican side because they've been losing. Attempting to try to suppress that vote and just depending on people showing up on the day of, and it hasn't worked out well for them.
All right, well, we'll leave it there. We've been talking this morning with the co-host of the Fulcrum's Vital Signs of Democracy podcast, Debilyn and Molineaux and David Riordan. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Tia.
Thank you.
And that's going to do it all for Washington Journal today. We'll be back tomorrow morning, 7 a.m.
C-SPAN's